Not to get political or anything, I personally don't have the energy to care about the brand being stuck under Disney anymore. But what I feel is easily one of the biggest casualties of Disney buying Star Wars is them taking an axe to LucasArts. Pretty audacious of Disney to be like, who needs these nerds that love and have worked on Star Wars their whole careers? We just need Disney Interactive to handle Star Wars games now. Wonder how that turned out. These days, Star Wars games are just EA being EA, and when EA is not cramming predatory monetization schemes in games you already paid full price for, they're releasing games that are not even finished. Assuming that is Endor and Kingdom Hearts 4, it's about to be the most excitement Star Wars video games have seen in a while. LucasArts almost felt like a magical publisher, being in charge of basically the whole video games division of Star Wars, which didn't always pan out for success, but I think even getting half the unironically good Star Wars games that we did is low-key a miracle, considering how licensed movie-based games usually turn out. I'll tolerate bargain bin bait like Episode 2 for GBA existing if we still get a Republic Commando or a Battlefront 2 out of it. Not that one. My first ever Star Wars game was Rogue Squadron for the N64, which was something of a dream game for little 6-year-old me. It's those cool Star Wars dogfights, but you get to fly the X-Wing yourself. What's not to love? Now, I'll be the first to admit, I don't exactly have a ton of experience with dogfight flight sim games. My only other exposure to the genre is like Star Fox, or the Gummy Ship from Kingdom Hearts, and even then those are more arcade-style shooters. So I don't really have a frame of reference for what constitutes a good one of these, other than, did I have fun or not? Kind of the most important part. It overall feels like a pretty standard application of the genre, but with a Star Wars skin over it. Instead of enemy planes, helicopters, and tanks, you have TIEs, probe droids, and AT-STs. It's a very let-you-loose kind of game, in that sense that you're given a set of mechanics and for the rest you're on your own, left to figure out how everything works. There's only a tutorial level, in that sense that the first level features nothing but easy targets like probe droids and TIE bombers flying in straight lines. The only aim assist is the A-Wing's blaster fire and the Y-Wing's ion cannon, so you're left to figure out how to lead your shots and outmaneuver enemies. While maybe not quite anything commendable, it does create challenging but satisfying gunplay for dogfights. One plus side of the sci-fi setting is how brightly colored the laser fire is, making them pretty obvious. In most cases, getting shot feels fair, except for a few very specific instances of getting pelted from off-screen. The handling of each craft is pretty clunky, but it works for the most part. The turn radius of everything feels like it makes sense, but the game has a tendency to argue with you, trying to force you back into a level position. Just a bit like you have a really annoying backseat driver. You can turn flight assist off, but that results in the game not trying to level you out at all. Sounds like the sort of thing that could have been on a button instead. While the turn radius seems fine in a vacuum, you're also having to account for the game's rather boxed-in level design. Most of the levels taking place in some canyon or a city. Because of this though, the game ends up feeling really claustrophobic, hindering your ability to turn a bit, which really starts getting in the way of dogfighting in places. It's one thing that this game has a lot of walls to run into, but it also has a strangely low flight ceiling. One that seems extremely arbitrary, seeing how often it changes between levels. Some levels offer the space that feels appropriate, but others feel like you're bumping your head a lot. This is probably in part because the draw distance is so lacking that they don't want you to fly too high and lose track of where the ground is. But the result is that the TIE fighters, especially the interceptors, have a lot more movement options than you do. In a vacuum, that's fine. It makes sense to have more challenging enemies in a flight game have more maneuverability than you. But in practice, it reduced a few airfights to clumsily flying in circles for a bit. It creates a duality, especially around the middle of the game, where TIE fighters go from idly flying around being easy pickings to never-endingly hounding you. This could have been balanced out with smarter allies that actually assist you, but all I've seen them do is fly in what seems like a preset path and mashing the fire button whenever enemies happen to wander in front of them. This was only an occasional struggle, but it still stuck out a few times in the game's short runtime. Each level starts you out with having to pick a particular craft for the mission, but revisiting a level widens your selection, offering replayability. Some levels feel specifically designed for one craft in particular, especially ones where the airspeeder is the only option. Each vehicle handles about the same, mainly differing in top speed and shielding. A-Wing being fast and frail, Y-Wing being slow but beefy, and X-Wing, as you'd imagine, is the middle ground. The V-Wing you unlock at the very end definitely feels like it's meant for folks seeking a higher skill ceiling, being a fast powerhouse that can really melt enemies with its rapid fire guns and cluster missiles. But feeling even more frail than the A-Wing, Plus, if you play a little too loose with the rapid fire mode, the cannons will overheat, leaving you a sitting duck for a while. The game really peaks in those moments where you have a non-crowded space to fight in. Levels like Corellia, Chandrilla, and Mon Calamari come to mind. Even then, though, a lot of the game's worst moments are when they just pepper the landscape with turrets. Deflates the ace spaceship pilot fantasy a bit to have a good chunk of your fighting be against stationary targets. Like, oh, I know there's a fight happening overhead, guys, but give me a minute, I gotta hug the ground and shoot these guys from below. The AT-STs feel a little bullet spongy, but at least an upgraded torpedo takes them out in one hit. AT-ATs are cool, though. They have a really commanding presence, as you'd expect. Don't take being in their cone of vision for granted, because, oof, ouchie. But at the same time, you'll usually have to clear the area around them first, since enemies aren't just gonna sit there and watch you tangle up their walker. I don't care how many times they gamify AT-AT wrangling in Star Wars games. It's just one of those things that has me like, man, I get to perform this iconic moment in Star Wars myself. Video games based on movies are so cool sometimes.
Cable out, let her go.
The game could do with either more level variety or cutting some of its fat out. For one thing, out of the 16 normal levels in the game, 6 of them are damn escort missions. Not overtly difficult ones, at least not until the ATPTs you have to protect. Yeah, the premises for the missions are a little silly sometimes. Like, these jackasses over here stole some Imperial vehicles, but they didn't bother to steal anything good, just some dinky little ATPTs, really helping the war effort. That's not to say there isn't something there, because at least the game's trying its best to do its own cool Star Wars moments, rather than just lifting moments fans are already familiar with. Okay, Han, it's less cool the second time. I just feel like some of the missions, especially the escorts, just have a tendency to drag. The third mission, Search for the Nona, has a cool premise. A rebel ship transporting stolen Imperial supplies crash lands and you gotta find it before the Imperials do. Its location actually being randomly generated each time you start the mission. Sadly doesn't stop the defense portion of the mission from being an auto-scroller though. The first Kessel mission is a nice standout with how quickly you can disable the train being something you're in direct control of. Same goes for Corellia, the only thing holding you back being how quickly you can dispatch the enemies. The final 2 story levels are kind of a mess though. Solist might as well be the Empire's turret storage warehouse, look at this. And Moff Cyrdan's revenge encapsulates so many of my nitpicks in this game. The annoyingly claustrophobic level design, forcing you to get up in the hills that are like 10 feet from the flight ceiling. The TIE interceptors are more aggressive than ever, and getting in a tussle with one of them usually means you're getting shot by something else. At this rate, it's a shocker it's not another damn escort mission. Instead, you get treated to the final boss, a mobile, flying homing missile platform. Goddamn. I just feel like a couple of these levels could have been cut out and we wouldn't be missing much. It's also just strange to me that it's a game that ranks you on time when so many of the missions are just waiting on a shuttle to finish its business. You really have to work to get those gold ranks too, because the prerequisites are pretty silly. If you fail in even one category, you get the medal below you, rather than feeling like a general summary of your skill. Plus, so many of the gold ranks require you to blow up an obscene amount of enemies, often needing you to go out of your way to destroy some dudes off to the side. You know, ignoring the objective, doing quite literally worse at your actual mission.
Commander, this is Riken. It's imperative you stay with the supply vehicles.
Yeah, that sounds like the tone of a man that's about to award me a gold medal. I beat the Kessel Run rescue mission in like a minute and a half, but it gave me a non-rank because boo-hoo, I didn't get distracted by enough enemies. I don't feel all that invested in rank chasing in this game, just rank chasing is what you need to do to unlock some content. This was the era of games where getting any less than 100% wasn't actually beating the game. Besides, uh-oh, another score attack game with no retry level button. It is nice though that they clue you in on which levels have the bonus pickups, which actually act as permanent upgrades for your ships, including upgraded secondary weapons and more powerful shielding, rather than merely being some temporary bonus. The radar in the corner can be useful for spotting out stragglers in your carnage, but when you have a lot of enemies and buildings lumped into a single space, it kinda just turns into a blob. Hard to glance at in the heat of combat. If nothing else, it'd be far better if the ties were differentiated, rather than just being a red dot like anything else. Something I definitely noticed in this revisit is how diegetic it feels, with very little of its presentation feeling gamey. It's not a game that asks you to suspend your disbelief very much. Very little abstractions that come with the territory of being a video game. It's just a gateway to the Star Wars universe, more or less. It even comes with a cockpit view, if you just hate being able to see. And this absolutely ridiculous cinematic camera button that makes it just about impossible to fight with. Love it. One cool thing that comes with translating Star Wars into video game format is that Star Wars already has such fantastic sound design that all you need to do is just lift that directly. The roar of a TIE fighter engine feeling like a heads-up sound, various blaster sounds, and the crusty comms effect from radio chatter. It's got it all. It even has some well-midified renditions of John Williams' score, because of course. And for a MIDI soundtrack version of classic Star Wars music, it's a pretty dang good OST, all things considered. None of the instrumentation is striking me as inappropriate, but it does have the bravery to pair up some of its own original music next to it, and it fits in decently well. The main theme of the Rogue Squadron series being, to me, one of the more iconic non-movie themes of Star Wars. The voice work is decent too, with the kind of banter you'd expect from a sci-fi action flick. You can have Neil Ross as General Riken read you Wikipedia articles on each craft.
The Incom T-65 X-Wing is the fighter that killed the Death Star. An almost perfect balance of speed, maneuverability, and defensive shields makes this the fighter of choice for Rogue Squadron, except when the mission profile disallows it.
Unironically, would listen to this guy read audiobooks of Star Wars reference material. I think the only very specific department where this game's presentation stinks is how all the environments are all dark, muddy-looking canyons. Not just because it's visually repetitive, but the TIE fighters have a tendency to really blend into the background, making them harder to aim at. Probably why no levels in this game actually take place in space, since that would just amplify the problem. There's already enough trouble with that in the moon level. It also feels like it just doesn't play to the visual strength of Star Wars. Which, while the settings in the Star Wars universe were usually more grounded back then, they still had a good sense of visual variety. I will hand it to them though, it's pretty ballsy to have the first 3D dogfighting Star Wars game and not have it just be a straight adaptation of the OT. No Battle of Yavin, Hoth, or Endor in the main game, just 16 totally original battles to this game. This was a pretty daring time for Star Wars games, since pretty much up until the Shadows of the Empire a year ago, almost any game with a story in it was just heavily based on pre-existing movies. The only mission featuring a classic Star Wars location is Tatooine in the first level. The rest of the planets are invented for this game, plus a handful picked from at the time extended universe, such as Corellia, Sullust, and Kessel. Ooh, Balmora, that's a bit of a deep cut. Gerard 5. What's next? Kyle 2. Oh. Some of them do feel like classic Star Wars locations in all but name, though. Talaran, aka definitely not Bespin, guys. Fest is the Battle of Hoth, but you're the one attacking an Imperial shield generator. Whoa, what a twist. The story itself has a lot of nothing going on, which is fine, because it feels a bit like each level is its own episode of Rogue Squadron, the Saturday morning cartoon. Stuff happens, there's hints here and there about continuity. Tune in next week. A plot synopsis is kind of just Kaysen Moore, an Imperial pilot, defects. She orders some hits, and then Moff Searden's angry about it, and then you blow him up. And then there's a non-sequitur epilogue level that time skips to after the Battle of Endor, and it acts like a big finale even though you just killed the villain in the last level. Not helped by how this game divides itself up into chapters for some reason. Literally the main story is 3 chapters, complete with its own text crawls, like the game thinks it's its own Star Wars trilogy. Like, that's almost adorable. The writing itself is also very Saturday morning cartoon.
General Reagan! It's all right, Luke. You held them off long enough. That was never my favorite building anyway.
The Empire just did Space 9/11, Han. I think it's better to take this game as a grab bag of Star Wars adventures rather than one unified story, since it's kinda narratively unsatisfying. Even Kaysen Moore, this game's OC, doesn't really go through much. You meet her already wanting to defect, and then she does. She'll comment on how weird it is to be on the other side after licking Imperial boot for so long, but that's kinda it. The most they do with it is that there's some very, very brief tension between Luke and Wedge on whether or not Kaysen's just tricking Rogue Squadron, which is rather short-lived and never brought up again. Moff Searden is also one of the lamest villains in all of Star Wars that I know of, and that's saying something. Not because he does anything I find offensive to the Star Wars brand, just simply because he's so mind-numbingly immemorable. A high and mighty Imperial Moff who waxes fascist talking points with little else to his character.
Unfortunate to lose such a fine officer, but the weak will die off to make room for the strong. It is the way of the universe.
Yawn. While this game is pretty flawed, one department it absolutely owns in is the sheer amount of bonus content it has. 3 bonus levels unlock when you get all bronze, silver, and gold medals respectively. And hey, it's the Death Star trench run and the Battle of Hoth. They're in here after all. Cool that they save a couple of Star Wars' more iconic battles for bonus content. There's also a handful of unlockable ships, also through medal getting. But you can also just resort to cheat codes. Yeah, remember that relic of the past? You can unlock ships like the Millennium Falcon and even the TIE Interceptor. Using the Falcon, of course, kinda feels like easy mode. Sturdiest ship in the game, and also it has auto-aim. A pretty fitting reward for basically 100%ing the game. Speaking of the cheat codes though, you can even use them to unlock a weird little bonus level where you pilot an AT-ST. The level itself feels like a dev test room, but it's neat. They didn't have to include it, but they did. Plus, you can insert an extra secret pair of codes to unlock the N1 Naboo starfighter, which is especially cool considering this game came out a year before Phantom Menace did. I just feel an extra need to highlight this because had this game been developed these days, all these bonus fighters and features would have been incentives for an $80 deluxe edition or something. This game is a very solid attempt to put fans in the pilot seat of an iconic Star Wars craft. It's littered with issues, being very rough around the edges and having nonsense difficulty curves, as well as an over-reliance on escort missions and bizarrely boxed-in level design. However, when this game hits its peaks, it hits them hard and with decently satisfying gunplay for how simple it is. Picking up the game for a lax playthrough every now and then isn't going to get old, barring maybe 2 levels that tempt turning on infinite lives. While narratively really shallow, it's still a pleasant romp through the Star Wars universe that I'll at least enjoy in the same vein as rewatching a cheesy old cartoon from my childhood. All it really needs is to reel in the difficulty a smidge to make it fair and challenging at the same time, as well as cutting a couple levels that feel more like filler, whether wholesale or to make the levels that are already there more substantive. The title really proves itself, being a good game in its own right and not just riding the coattails of a brand's mega success, something that can't be said of a lot of licensed games, let alone every Star Wars game.